Hello, everybody, and good morning. Thank you so much for tuning into the show yet again. I'm here to tell you guys that it is about time that you follow or subscribe to the show wherever you listen. I know y'all are out there listening and you're not subscribing and you're not following the show, and I don't like that kind of behavior. You guys know I'm tired of working these garbage jobs, wasting my time. The links are in the description of the show wherever you listen. All the links, all the social media links, all the different platforms. Wherever you listen, all I ask is to subscribe, to follow. Please, please, I'm begging you, subscribe, follow, and most importantly, enjoy today's episode. Hello, Mr. Keith Kitz. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We finally were able to make it happen. A little preparation here and there, back and forth, but
Yes.
I'm happy we made it happen.
We have been working through it, and I appreciate your patience and I appreciate your flexibility. I certainly wanted to do this sooner when we talked about doing it a while back, and there's been a lot of things that have come up. So again, happy to be here, happy to chat with you.
Yeah. I got to say, I love the sweatshirt. It's perfect for an artist.
I had someone say to me yesterday, "You have an interesting collection of sweaters," and I said, I appreciate the word interesting. I never use it as kind of a put down or a curse, so I appreciate when people say that, and thank you.
Right.
I believe that I have to live the part. As a designer, I always want to be authentic, and I like things that are colorful, and I love typography. So when I can find something that feels like this, I love to be in the uniform of the field, in my opinion.
Right. I love that. I've always been an advocate for that. Being literally what you said, playing the part. Being a person that's in the space and doing all the things that all the successful people in that space do. I think it's only conducive to success in the area. So I love that.
I completely agree.
Now, I'd rather you tell everybody what is it that you specifically teach at Suffolk University?
So I have been at Suffolk off and on since 2013. So my first run was 2013 to 2016, and I was here as an adjunct instructor, as a lecturer, and I taught a variety of things, all that live in the world of graphic design. So I taught typography, and I taught introductory level classes, some graduate level classes. In 2018, I was fortunate enough to be able to come back full time, and I'm now working tenure track here full time, and I am primarily working with two student groups. I'm the director of the master's program in graphic design, so I'm working with the master's students. So I do everything from the standpoint of looking at and reviewing applicants, interviewing applicants, getting people into the program, so the recruiting side of things. I also work with them throughout their thesis process. We have a multi-stage thesis process that they work on, basically an independently driven project, but it has lots of different moments inside of it, and targeted points that they're needing to meet certain deliverables. So I do the management of that for those types of classes. I also teach some studio classes on the graduate side. And then on the undergraduate side, I'm primarily working with the seniors. So I work with them in the fall in a class that's called GD3. And in the spring, which is currently, I'm working with them in a class called GD4, which are their two capstone classes. So they're really working through all of the final stuff that goes into the final portfolio, all the stuff that's pointing them into the field. So I really love that I can work with students in the space of transition primarily.
Now, as someone who went to school for, I guess you can say, for lack of a better term, a traditional subject like finance, and it's kind of the subject. I shouldn't say the subject matter, but what you do in terms of assignments as a student in there, they're kind of similar to other subjects in that you take certain tests and you prepare different presentations and that type of thing. What does a master's program for graphic design look like? Because in my mind, it's always been kind of abstract to, I guess, master or study an art. It's kind of just been something that I guess I had never really understood.
Well, I love to demystify things, so I'm happy to help with that. From the standpoint of, so I can only speak for our program because, each program might have its own sorts of philosophies and pedagogy. So from the standpoint of our program, for most students, if they're coming into the program with a previous visual degree, so they've been either in a graphic design undergraduate degree or some type of visual related degree, most of those students, after they've applied, can come into what I call the sort of direct admittance part of the program. So they will be here for a year and a half because this is an MA, not an MFA. And we are really looking to prepare them for the field. So there's maybe a little less sort of theory. In an MFA, you would have that theoretical component as well. So we're really looking at teaching them things like UX UI and teaching them things like web design. Also from the standpoint of the thesis is, again, an independently driven project. It does have class spaces where it meets, but each student in that class, so if there are 15 students in the class, each one is generating something that's meaningful for them and that they can use leaving here to promote themselves. So it might be something that is like a brand project. It might be something that is an application type project, a website based project. I really want students and try to get students more and more to focus on multidisciplinary deliverables. So they're looking at things that might live in multiple spaces and in multiple different types of media, because that's really where the field is now. So if it's a matter of, we're looking at a product, the product has a brand, the product has a brand dress, it has a color palette, it has typography that promotes that product. But there's also a website, there's an Instagram space, there might be an application. So across the board, there are all these places where that product lives, and all of those places need the attention of a designer. And in the real world, there's usually multiple people on multiple teams. So it's challenging to get students to understand in this space. It's like you're the person driving like all of these deliverables. So we have to make them manageable from the standpoint of time, but it's also good for them to understand how all of those things work. So when they get out in the field, they can, even if they're not on, say, the social media team, they know how to work with that person who's on the social media team or those multiple people who are on that team. I talk to students about this from the standpoint of like when I was in my undergraduate degree, I had multiple photography classes. I am in no way, shape, or form a photographer. I would never tell anybody that I was, had that title, and really respect people who are in that portion of the field. But because I've taken these classes, I know how to art direct photo shoot. I know how to speak with a photographer, talk to them in the language of that portion of the field or in their discipline. So really that's another reason for wanting students to be multi-leveled in their thinking from the standpoint of a thesis project.
So it's very much about kind of building the skills to be well-rounded, as well as building a portfolio that'll show to, say, a future employer that, hey, this is my specialty, but I'm able to do these other things as well.
Absolutely. Everything about, especially on the graduate level, because they're here for, such a short period of time, is professional facing. So it really is about, let's hit the ground running and prep you for moving into the field. Now, I had mentioned sort of the path for people who are coming in with a visual degree. We certainly are also a bit of an exception in the master's world from the standpoint of we also accept students who don't have a visual background and might be a career changer. So they've been in some other type of field, but they've always had this sort of draw to do visual things. and maybe don't have that formalized skill training. So we have the ability to do a 2-year program. So instead of being here for 3 semesters, they would be here for 4, and they would start in the fall and go through a series of very rigorous, almost like a boot camp, to prepare them to move into the back half of the program. So it is a bit daunting, and the whole program is rigorous, but I would say that the leveling portion is very mindful of a little bit more increased rigor from the standpoint of I have no desire to waste anybody's time, and I am very cognizant of the investment. Education is expensive, and I can say this to students because, I have 2 degrees and I've paid for both of them myself. A little bit of scholarship here and there, but most of it I paid for. Some of it I'm still paying for. So, I'm really, really aware of, especially being in a very expensive city from the standpoint of cost of living, and understanding that time literally is money when it comes to being a student.
Right. Oh yeah, that's a given. So basically, that other program that you were mentioning was you take someone who, I don't know, say was a history major, they're interested in maybe putting together a history book, and they might want to go ahead and learn some of these techniques. Is that safe to say?
Um, it could be that, but a actual example, without leaving out names. We had a student a few years ago who came into the program and had a writing degree. It was an English major, so literature was the background and writing was the background. But again, was always interested in visual making, like had some interest in photography, and kind of knew that it's like, hey, I have this passion and love for words, and I have this passion and love for visuals, and have never had the opportunity to bring those 2 things together. And that's exactly what graphic design has the power to do. It has the power to bring words and images together. So a student like that is prime for that space of leveling, so they can take some classes, learn things like the software that is used in this field, learn the basics and the fundamentals, and then they can transition into the other classes that the rest of the cohort is in.
Now,
So the end product might not be, necessarily that person who's interested in books might not be a book. And for this person, it certainly was not. That person's thesis became a multidisciplinary, multimedia exhibition. There was lots of animation and video. All of it had to deal with word and image, though.
right. Okay, so it was like a blend. It's a
Yes.
blend of the both. Okay. Now, last week I had my buddy Greg come on, and he's very well versed in the world of NFTs and the metaverse and all this, for lack of a better term, crazy kind of stuff that's happening right now. That one day will probably
all this stuff that's looming out there somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. But whether we like it or not, there's a good chance that it could be a big part of our lives at some point.
Of course.
And I was speaking to him, and it seems like it's a very interesting time for not only artists, but specifically graphic designers, because now, as you may know or you may have heard, it is tough as an artist to go ahead and make a living being solely a freelance worker.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Whereas now these NFTs have created a secondary marketplace for graphic design and graphic art.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting that you bring that up. And I saw that episode had occurred. I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm really interested in it from the standpoint of I don't know a whole lot about NFTs, and I have read about them, been following it as it develops, and it's really kind of an interesting. It feels very much like the beginnings of social media from the standpoint of everybody was really interested in it, and then it kind of fell off for a minute, and now it's having this like second life and the second resurgence very quickly. So I'm pretty fascinated by that. I had some colleagues from Korea contact me last semester, and they wanted me to be involved in this project that they were doing that was NFT based. And I felt completely ill prepared to be involved in it from the standpoint of they wanted me to be on a jury that was going to like judge these NFTs that were being made by students, and then the NFTs were going to be in some sort of marketplace or exhibition. And I just, was very honest with them. And I'm like, my skill set are these things. And I'm not sure that it would be appropriate for me to, evaluate these things. I could look at them from the standpoint of really design only and not from the standpoint of function. So I am interested in going back and listening to that because it is something where um, I have seen like designers that I follow that are starting to kind of seep into this world and are interested in it as well. And I certainly have some interest in it. Um, I always talk to students about design being a living organism from the standpoint of how it is constantly changing. So the great thing about especially people like myself who are really curious, or like some of the people that are friends of mine, or even some of the students who maybe have a short attention span, it's like if you're not interested in this thing right now, there's something on the horizon that's going to really activate you. So the digital space is really a space that is becoming that skill set is becoming highly sought after. And it really is a matter of, again, that's why I want students to focus on being multidisciplinary while they're here. Certainly, when they leave here, they might specialize in one niche space inside of the field. But especially when it's digital facing, there's all kinds of opportunities.
Right. Now, since we're on the topic already, prior to NFTs, what I guess is what was the other outlet to be a freelance graphic designer? Obviously, you could be employed by a company, and that's a little different. But
Mhm.
as someone
Sure.
who just kind of creates and sells their art, what's kind of the process or kind of the way someone could go about that?
So I think everybody kind of finds their way into it a little differently. Um, I know the world loves the word freelance. I hate the word freelance, and I don't use the word hate often, but I hate the word freelance because it has the word free in it. And clients see the word free and they're like, this is going to be either cheap or it's going to be actually free. So I tend to use the term contractor from the standpoint of like, I even have seen myself in that light from the standpoint of I do collaborative work on what technically would be called a freelance basis, where I'm partnering with firms who have overflow work or have special need from the standpoint of I specialize in branding. So I can come in and work with someone from the standpoint of if they need a logo or a brand mark developed, if they need to work with strategy, like all of those things are my skill set. And I've worked in the commercial world for a very long time, and I've worked in the corporate world as a creative director, really specializing in that world of brand and brand development. And left that space because I wanted to be able to have the flexibility to do both teaching as well as the commercial work. So from the standpoint of getting started, I think now more than ever, social media is key. You've got to have lots of different places where you're getting your imagery out there so that people know kind of what your aesthetic sensibilities are. I'm not someone who believes that you can only have like one style. Certainly, so if you're someone who's versatile, show that from the standpoint of your Instagram. There's a site called Behance, which is owned by Adobe, which is basically like a social media platform for creative people. So photographers are there, graphic designers are there, web developers, application developers, UX UI people. There's lots of people that are in that space. And if I'm someone who's coming to that space and needs an illustrator, they have a search function where I can type in what I'm searching for and see everybody who's tagged things that are related to that category of illustration. So certainly from the standpoint of freelance, being visible is key. Word of mouth is key. So if you're taking on jobs, you have to take on the jobs with, I would say, even a stronger sense of responsibility to what you're doing, and be very mindful of, the deadlines that you're making, the way that you're communicating, all the things that you're doing are top notch, so that that person can refer you to the next person, because referrals are the key to driving freelance. So, being reliable, being committed, being passionate, listening. So it's really challenging for a lot of folks to make the transition from the educational space, where there is some freedom to kind of do whatever you want inside of a project. So like I was saying, with the capstone project on the senior side and the thesis project on the graduate side, both of these are self-driven. So, I'm helping and guiding them from the standpoint of creating things that would fit that market share, but it's still like the look and feel is all up to them. Once you involve a client, like that's a different relationship. It's almost like a marriage rather than just like, I'm just creating whatever I want. So from the standpoint of marketing work that's going to be commercial and collaborative, it has to be primarily, a working relationship where you're willing to take feedback, you're willing to make changes, you're willing to work through the process, the creative process. From the standpoint of freelance that might be, or marketing things that might be not related to commerce in the way of like I'm making for a client, certainly there are outlets for anyone to produce things and sell things that are, like if I might make a logo that then could be applied to, or an illustration or a composition that could be applied to a product, and selling those is another way that I think that people fund this sort of freelance sphere of their work.
That was an interesting point that you brought up about how, one that I guess I never really thought of. One, when you're in college, you do kind of have a lot of freedom, depending on whatever major you're in. There is more or less choices, and especially in capstone courses, because when I'll tell you, when I was at Rhode Island College and I had my capstone course, it was basically pick a topic in finance and write a really long paper about it.
Yeah.
Research paper, pick a topic, convince us of something, inform us on something, present it, boom. And then, you kind of don't realize that once you get employed or you get into the professional field, now it's about doing something that's specific to the company, doing something that's specific to the relationship, like you were saying. Something I never really thought about.
Yeah, I try really hard in the classes that I teach, especially kind of leading up to now it's all about them and all about their individual projects. I try really hard to have a lot of frank conversations about this is the reality of what's coming. Mostly because I, especially, not to throw shade on anyone that was an instructor of mine in undergrad, because I really value the teachers in my life. There's been so many of them that are great, but I did feel ill-prepared leaving undergraduate, especially, and moving into the marketplace. So I have very frank conversations with students about, the realities of working with clients, the realities of this synthetic environment of school and the commercial environment. And we also do things like we'll have group projects. So, when you're in a group project, you're not making all of the decisions. You have to negotiate the decisions with team members. We also are fortunate enough to be on a campus that's a liberal arts campus, so we can also collaborate with other programs. So we have an entrepreneurship program where we often bring in real clients for students to be working with and partnering with those business students on, outcomes that could potentially be used.
Right. I think it is incredibly important because of how much time we spend in school, regardless of whether you go to college afterwards, to have realistic but also optimistic professors and teachers, because especially in a field of art, because
Yeah.
a lot of them can get bitter. They can resent the fact that their student might have this more or less grandiose idea of what they can do, and kind of put them down. And a bad teacher can really, or a negative teacher can really ruin it could ruin the trajectory of a student. They could completely say, you know what, I'm not even going to try and do this anymore because this teacher doesn't think that what I want to do is possible. And it's so imperative to have a positive but also realistic professor, especially in a field of art.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's so my feeling about being an educator is that I have such a responsibility to the students that I interface with and the students that I work with. And I'll go even a level further from the standpoint of, you know, as much as I work in the art and design department, I always refer to myself as an instructor or a teacher or an educator at Suffolk University. So I welcome students from other programs to come and talk to me if they have questions about things, or if they, are working on a project and they need to interview someone or whatever it might be. Because of the fact that, again, to your point, we are all modeling behavior, and we need to make sure that people feel supported and accepted and encouraged here. And so it is one of those things where I take all of that hyper seriously from the standpoint of helping people through not only their coursework, but helping them be prepared for moving into the real world, and also supporting them from the standpoint of alumni. Like, I have students who, come back, and especially with the advent of Zoom, I can talk to students who are all over the world who, still have questions, and they're like, oh, I have this burning question that I need answered, and I know that I can go to Keith and he'll help me. Yes, that's what I'm here to do, because I had people do that for me. And, mentorship, which is a word that I struggle with, because I think that it has a lot of connotations to it that are really heavy. And I think it can be a bit more friendly, and it doesn't have to be this sort of daunting and like kind of setting one person here and one person here. Like we can be here and have a human conversation with one another. But it is one of those things where I take all of that very seriously as well, from the standpoint of exactly what you said. I've seen this happen when I was a student, where someone was so excited about something and so passionate about it, and then it just got ripped to shreds in a critique. And I do not critique work that way. I'm very careful about how I critique work. I find positives and certainly talk about the negatives, and then come back at the end to something positive, so that it's all sort of packaged in a way where it's bookended by positives, and then we can deal with this thing in the middle that needs to be dealt with. As opposed to, I know, I have mentors and know people and had teachers who had instructors from kind of what I refer to as kind of the old school of graphic design, where, literally you put your stuff up on the wall, and the instructor would come in and like mark out stuff they didn't like, or take something down off the wall if they didn't like it, or tear it up and throw it in the trash if they didn't like it. Like, all of that is so vile to me, as far as like, that's not education. That's being a bully.
Right. It's also about, as an instructor, being open to different ideas that aren't necessary. Because a lot of what happens is people get involved, or I shouldn't say involved, they get too wrapped up in what they've learned and their ideologies,
Yeah.
that they think it's the only way, and God forbid they diverge from it, which is I mean, that's for lack of a better term, that's a very negative quality for an instructor to have. It should be, hey, what I'm doing. Once they recognize it's wrong, or there's a maybe not even wrong, maybe there's just a better way to do it, then you would hope that they would accept that and change. But
Mhm.
you
Yep.
know, people are flawed, I guess.
Yeah, I tell students all the time, and I especially talk about this a lot when I'm doing during the recruiting phase for the master's program. And I do also uh, participate in some recruiting for the undergraduate side, but a bit less than the graduate side. I always tell them that we're not here to indoctrinate them to a specific style or aesthetic sensibility, that we're here to really help them to grow from the standpoint of understanding the foundations and the fundamentals, but we're also here to help them to craft their voice, independent of me. I don't grade from the standpoint of like my aesthetic sensibilities. So if it doesn't look like something I would make, then it would get an F. That makes no sense. That's just absurd. So I look at it from the standpoint of I'm always looking at what's been produced and how it points to the real client or the hypothetical client and how it would work in the world. So again, basing it into reality. So if that makes sense, then that is really what we should be evaluating. It shouldn't be, well, I hate pink. I don't hate pink, by the way. I hate pink, so it shouldn't be pink, or I hate this certain typeface, so shouldn't be that. Now, certainly there might be typographic choices that are more appropriate, and I'm certainly happy to talk to students about that. But it is a matter of, I think we all, from the standpoint of education, no matter what you're teaching, have to be very aware of how you're teaching it and how you're evaluating it.
Now, is there, because that's also a great point. Is there ever, when you're grading and critiquing, I guess, is there ever a space for technical critique, like based like technique, like we could do this way, or you didn't execute this technical factor to the
Yeah,
ability that it should be?
tech, technical factors are always something that I'm looking at. So I often refer to that as craft from the standpoint of, if you're developing a certain type of file, there are ways to go about creating that file so it doesn't have a lot of excess things in it that you don't need. So to give an example, like in the world of Illustrator, you have like what's called the art board. So it's the space where we're making the art. And then there's all this area around it where you could have things that maybe you're testing, or I drew this shape and I'm using it, and then I decide I'm not using it, but I'm not going to delete it yet. I'm just going to set it aside. And it's like it's living on your like hypothetical desk. Those things should be deleted before you hand them in, because
Right.
those things should be deleted before you hand them off to a printer or you hand them off to a client. And sometimes students don't take that care. And certainly that's a factor that would be, uh, negligible when it comes to grading. So yes, like there are certain uh, constructs, structural factors, and all of those things, depending on the assignment, are spelled out in a project brief and discussed in the class.
Now let's take it back a little bit.
Sure.
What brought you to decide that you wanted to be an artist? Because for a lot of people, and was it early on? Because for a lot of people, when they're young, families have the tendency to try and steer their, children, I guess, in a way of, I guess you could call safety. And
Yeah.
not saying that you can't get a job as an artist, but it's more or less correlated with that term we used earlier, freelance or contractor, as you like to say.
Yeah.
And it's a little more uncertain. So, was it early on that you decided that artistry was something you wanted to pursue?
So this is always a fun topic to talk about in interviews because I am incredibly fortunate from the standpoint of my father was a painter,
Mm.
and he's no longer with us, but he struggled his entire life to kind of get into galleries and get into shows and to get noticed. And I saw that when I was coming up. And my mother is always says, you know, she's not visual at all and is not creative at all, which I don't necessarily believe. But she just, you know, doesn't make things like I make things or make things like my dad made things. Um, but I have my whole life been surrounded by people who are what I call like makers or artisans. Like my grandmother was a crocheter and a crafter and a baker, and I have an uncle who is a sculptor and a florist. Like, so all these people in my life who, you know, did all of these things that they did with their hands, and they, you know, were building things and making things and constructing things, and they were starting oftentimes with like raw materials or what looked like nothing, and then something extraordinary happened. So I have really been blessed to be in an environment where that was happening. The other thing is that I'm really fortunate with the fact that my parents were very aware of the need and the power of education. So my dad didn't even graduate high school. He got to a point in his high school career where he had exactly what you're talking about earlier, those bad teachers. And he just was like, I'm done with this. And the family was in a financial situation where he was like, you know, I'm just going to go to an apprenticeship school. I'm going to learn a trade and I'm going to go to work. And, you know, he did that. And that was, you know, it worked for him. But I think, again, if not for those bad teachers, he might have graduated high school and gone on to other things. My mom, you know, finished high school and I think was kind of, you know, again, ready to go into the working world and was just done with being in that space. But from the standpoint of my siblings and I, they were always very vigilant of education and the power of education in our lives. So we didn't just necessarily go to the local schools. I'm from Cincinnati originally. So when I was coming up in the 80s, there was this program called the Alternative School Program. And these were schools that were like testing different educational environments. And my parents sought those programs out, and you had to like apply to be in those programs. And there was like a waiting list to be in those programs. So, you know, I was fortunate enough to go to some really cool schools and be in with really passionate teachers. And I went to this school that has an incredibly long name because it was basically a school where they were starting to pilot student teaching with the University of Cincinnati in middle school, so 4 through 6. So I was fortunate enough to be in that school, and that's where I really encountered. So I had great teachers first, you know, K through 3, but in 4th grade, I had the teacher who really was the teacher where it was like, I want to do that. And his name was Jay Williams, and he just taught in a way that was just, you know, it was entertaining, it was inviting, it felt safe, it felt supportive. And he was incredibly inspirational to me. And then the list after him just kept going up and up and up from the standpoint of after leaving that school, I was fortunate enough to attend an arts high school where I majored in visual art. So in that space, I was also being sort of prepped and primed for a career in the arts and supported from the standpoint of people saying to me on a daily basis, this can be your job. And this is the way, you know, and the path and like how you get gallery shows and how you know, prep portfolios. And, you know, they were very helpful in preparing me to go into, you know, higher education from the standpoint of getting us ready for college. So it was a very different experience than just like the local, you know, neighborhood school that didn't have that specialty factor to it. So, you know, I credit my parents all the time with the fact that their vigilance towards education, even though they are not college graduates, I'm the only person in my family that has a master's degree. And and my sister and I were the first generation to go to college from, our sort of nuclear family. So um, I, I credit them and I credit the support of, again, this wealth of great teachers. And I've had lots of conversations about teaching as someone who wanted to be a teacher. Um, and I think more often than not, the scenario you mentioned earlier with people having what you refer to as a bad teacher is sadly been the case for a lot of people.
Right. Now, you had mentioned that from a young age, third grade, fourth grade, you pretty much knew that you wanted to pursue something in the field of artistry, which it's something that I always talk about on the show.
Hmm.
If I could advocate one thing for people, and I try hard not to because, who am I? But um, the
I'm going to come back to that. I have something to say about that. I'll come back to that.
do the things that made your eyes light up as a child. The things that, whatever it was, try your hardest to keep that going as an adult, because what happens when you become, when you get older, different things kind of creep in. Things that didn't matter when you were a kid, money,
Oh yeah.
mostly it's pretty much money for the most part.
I always say stability
Yes.
because, it's money, it's a roof over your head. It's like all these things that do, dwindle down to money. But yeah, I agree. And I've certainly had lean, lean times. So I understand that point of things too, as well.
Yeah, but I've always said if you can somehow make a living and get that stability through whatever it was that you enjoyed doing as a child, then I mean you figured it out. You've definitely figured it out.
Yeah, I know it is a bit sort of used a lot, and it's cliche when people say, that they're blessed, but I feel incredibly blessed, incredibly fortunate to have become the creature I wanted to be, from the standpoint of, I think it takes a lot of mental preparation, a lot of planning, a lot of investment, from the standpoint of, the education that I have done, but also the education that I've done outside of like formalized education and in college. Um, but it is really, finding the course and staying the course. Like, what is the North Star that you're driving toward, and not letting it, get, yes, certainly, like you're talking about, there are obstacles that come up. My life has been filled with them. I started undergraduate at a school that I thought was going to be the school, because I did all of my research, went to what's called a national portfolio day, met with people, loved the people that I met with, had multiple conversations with them after, was fortunate enough to be offered a full scholarship to the school, moved and went to the school, and basically the program that I was promised didn't exist. I was the guinea pig for the program. And at, 20 nothing years old, I didn't feel confident enough or self-assured enough to be that person. So I was like, I got to get out of here. Like, this is all, feels like the walls are just coming down around me. And then I went home and actually enrolled in the school where my sister was, because I also felt like if I took a semester off, I might not go back to school. And again, then like the whole dream falls apart, because the dream was always, even though it took a long time to get into this space, the dream was always to teach.
Right. Now, isn't it an interesting thing that kind of happens? And I don't know if this has happened for you. It sounds like that was a little bit of like it was definitely a setback, but it was kind of a maybe an aha moment, or maybe a let's kind of switch course and figure out a new way to make this happen. it is very interesting that a lot of those times happen when you're young, when you're in your 20s, and it is liberating.
It's it's the reason that I became a graphic designer, because that program that I was in, I had all through high school was prepping to become a fashion designer. And that was what I was wanting to go to college for, and basically got in, into this program, accepted to this program. And they're like, oh yeah, we have a full program. And it was like, got there and, they didn't even own a sewing machine. And it was just like, and when I'd gone there for the site visit and the sort of stay over for orientation, was just kind of led to believe that that stuff was, being worked on and couldn't get into those areas because of, whatever reason. And it was just because it didn't exist. And, it is interesting that it was like I felt shattered in that moment, but it also was a reset that pushed me into the field of graphic design, because I had taken what was called commercial art at the time, one commercial art class in high school, and kind of liked it, but it wasn't painting, it wasn't sculpting, and that was what I was really passionate about. And that's why I felt that moving into the space of fashion design, which I would be like creating and sculpting with other material, but still doing something that was multidimensional, felt like it was a good transition. You had mentioned parents and sort of an artist and this whole thing of like wanting people to be able to make a living. My dad's struggles always came up from the standpoint of, he wanted me to be a painter, but he didn't want me to be a painter because he didn't want me to not be able to make a living. So when he started to see ways where I could sort of kind of commercialize or work in a visual field or an art field that had some commercial value, he was very interested in that. So he was, supportive from those standpoints. But, it's a struggle, because I think for anybody who is a parent, I'm not a parent, but anyone who's a parent, I think it's really, you want to support, but you also don't want people to not have the things that they need to have a safe, comfortable, stable existence.
Right. And it's such a conflict, because there's little steps that an artist takes that are huge to them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting paid. Like, for example, I'm outside of this podcast, I'm a comic. So I recently did a show in New York, and
Congratulations. That's
you.
Huge.
Yeah. And it was my first one, and I had a great time, had a phenomenal set. I got a video made, professional video made. I can send it out to all different places. That's a big deal for someone like me. And my grandmother, she's the sweetest person in the world. She's 85 years old world,
awesome,
straight from Italy. And I told her about it, and she's like, "You get paid? Did you get paid?" And I'm like, no, I didn't get paid, but I got all these other things. And she's like, okay, all right. And I understand, of course, but it is great that you had, and you have a great support system, and you come from a family of crafters, like you said, and artists. And that's a huge advantage.
Yeah. I truly do not take that lightly, because I, certainly work with people now and have known people my entire life who didn't have that, and didn't have that support at home, or whatever home is. So whatever that network, that base, that foundation in your life is mission critical. And I said this when we talked months ago and kind of starting the early arrangements of this. I have great admiration for people who are performers of any type. I think that takes such a very unique skill set. It also requires a tremendous amount of preparation and a tremendous amount of letting inhibitions go. And, I'm just in awe of people who can do that, because, I always thought, what would it have been like if I would have gone into comedy? Because there's, everybody that was coming up in, in the 80s like me saw a lot of like the burgeoning of stand up. And again, being in an art school and being around performers, it's like, oh, that looks fun. That looks interesting. But I've never done it. I've never tried it. I don't know that I ever will, but I just have great admiration and respect for people who are out there on the stage. So bravo.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of performers, regardless of, comics or actors or anybody that goes up on a stage, the reason why they're able to do that is because that's one of the few places that I think that they're able to let those inhibitions go, which is strange because for most people, the second biggest fear is public speaking for most people. It's,
Yeah.
it's nerve wracking for a lot of people. And for whatever reason,
Oh, yeah.
performers are able to do that, but they're not able to do the other stuff. That's why a lot of them are quote unquote strange, or people might think they're weird outside of whatever their realm is. So it is very interesting that they're, for whatever reason, we can get up there and do our thing fairly freely. And it comes with repetition, because at first you're like, and then,
Yeah.
after a while, it kind of comes to you. But
I like to talk to students about the fact that I think anything that's worth doing is worth repeating, from the standpoint of, if you want to get better at something, you have to do the drills. So I can't play basketball because I didn't put in the work to become someone who plays basketball. I tried, at one point, and in the backyard, we had a hoop on the garage, and I tried for a couple of days and I quit because it was too difficult, and it was hot outside, and it was
right,
like, oh, a lot of these things were just like, and but there are people who've gone on to greatness in that realm, who were out there in the rain and in the snow and in the whatever, because they're like willing to do the drills every day. So it is a matter of, you got to put in the work. I always like to talk about the fact that when we're talking about creativity, that I think, and I know that I've mentioned prior, because my mom will listen to this, because my mom is super supportive and supports everything that I'm a part of. So sorry, Mom, I'm going to use a word you probably don't like. I think that when people talk about creative blocks, that I always tell students that creative blocks are bullshit, because they're you not willing to do the work. Like, looking at a blank page or a blank screen, or in your world, like, a blank notebook, and just sitting there and staring at it, like, that's not doing the work. You got to be willing to like write the stuff that doesn't work, or make the things that maybe look ugly, if we want to use that word, or don't work for that specific client. You got to be willing to do the iteration to get to that moment of, that's the thing.
right. I also heard somewhere, I don't know where this quote is from, but I'm sure it can be, I guess it can be used for a field of artistry as well. To be an entertainer, you must be entertained. So
Yes.
part of that work is also a bit of homework and studying
Yeah.
and watching the greats and
Yeah.
learning from some of these guys that do certain things very well. This guy is
Yeah.
great at storytelling. If I want to up my storytelling, I got to kind of copy what this guy's doing, more or less. I got to take a piece
Yeah.
from him.
I believe so. I have always been naturally curious. This is another wonderful thing that my parents really fed into. If we would have something in the house, like, we had a radio once that broke, and instead of, and, my dad would try to fix things, and sometimes was successful and sometimes was not. But instead of like taking that and just throwing it into the trash, they gave it to me and let me take it apart and see, like, because I was very interested in all of what was happening inside of there. So I was able, I took it apart and made other stuff out of it, which I'm sure was, made a mess. But, they didn't worry about me, like, the risking, like cutting myself or any of these things, from the standpoint of like, there's metal in there and sharp things in there. It's like, they told me to be careful. They were vigilant of what I was doing. but and supportive of it from the standpoint of they fed that curiosity. And I tell students all the time that like to be creative is to live in the world. So you've got to be out there, going to things and reading books and going to movies and going to plays and museums and just taking a walk, for goodness sakes, like getting away from a screen and like getting out of the phone and like, actually observing the world around you. Because especially in a city like Boston, there's so much to see, even without having to spend a dime. Like when I'm just out taking a walk and observing, all of the sounds that I'm hearing that are different languages and all of the different ways that people dress and all of the ways that people carry themselves and their distinct features. It's like all of that stuff is going to feel something at some point. So it is, I completely agree with you from the standpoint of you have to be willing to do the homework, as you put it, which I don't like the word homework because it always is one of those things where it's hard to talk to students about homework without using that term. But that term to me always feels like it lives in the high school world.
Right.
And, I never want, especially undergrads, to think about this space being an extension of that space. Like this is something new and you need to meet it as something new.
Now, I wanted to ask you, because this is something that I'm always interested in when I speak to an artist. What is, if you have a way to describe it, what is your creative process?
Attrition.
Hey, whatever works, I guess.
It really depends on what it is that I'm working on. So we'll talk about like basically like two different buckets of types of work. So when I'm doing commercial facing work for a client, so I'm working on an engagement with a client and we're, working on a brand per se. I have to meet with them. I have to talk with them. I have to listen very carefully to them so that I understand their wants, their needs, their desires, all the things that need to be represented in this mark that I'm going to make for them. And then I have to do research. So I have to understand the market share of, they're a bottled water company. So how do they, what does that market share look like? And how can I help them to look unique inside of that space? And then I have to generate a lot of options. And then before sharing a million options with them, which I would never do and don't suggest anyone ever does, I have to pre-select. And usually what I'll do in that stage is I send things out to my, trusted group of people that I can get good, solid feedback from. If I were in, collaborating with the studio, we would have a meeting in that studio and, the other artists or designers in that studio would review the work before it was sent on to the client. But there has to be sort of that intermediary step before it goes client facing. And then from the standpoint of it becoming client facing, I never just share the logo with them. I have to share the strategy with them first. So a lot of that is repeating to them the things that they've said to me. So I'm setting the stage and then there's the reveal of what the work is. So that would be like my creative process in the commercial field or the commercial sector. When it comes to the other type of work that I do, which is the self-generated work, from the standpoint of I make a poster every day and have made a poster every day since 2014. And yes, I did make one today, but it hasn't been posted yet because I post all of them to my Facebook account and have, again, every year since 2014. Some days I'll even make more than one, but it is something that I think it's critically important for anyone who has something that they're getting paid for that's a creative pursuit, that they still have something that they're holding on to for themselves, because it feeds me from the standpoint of in ways that the commercial work can't. And if the commercial work gets, because it's a partnership, sometimes the commercial work will feel more like the client and less like me. Sometimes, like, we want to be here if we can, but there's all different variants of places where that can be. So the stuff that I'm making for myself has no client involved. It has no timeline involved. It has no deadline involved, except for what I've imposed on myself. And that process really is about meeting each day in a space that, whatever works into my schedule, a meeting. And that is like almost like a Zen space or a meditative space or a restful making space, from the standpoint of, it's like I kind of zone out and I'm making in that space. More recently, I would say within the past 2 years or so, a lot of that work has been more collage based, which I've always loved that making. And it's interesting to be someone who's now won awards for that type of making, because when I was in high school and made collages, those were the works that got C's. And now I'm making this work that's like in international shows and gets, accolades and stuff. So it's really interesting how, you really do become better if you keep doing it.
Right.
I'm proof of that. So it's, that whole process is quite different from the standpoint of, it doesn't have all those trappings of working with and collaborating with someone else. I'm really just collaborating with the materials and the time that I've set aside for it. And they're inspired by all sorts of things. Sometimes they're more personal. Sometimes they're, I could overhear a conversation on the T, and that's something that inspires me. Or I read an article and that inspires me. Or there's a certain marker or event that inspires me. So inspiration for me is something that can be found anywhere.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, that's a testament to what we were saying before. It can be found anywhere. I'm a huge Miles Davis fan, and there was
Oh yeah.
him. I forgot. I think it was an interview, but he was talking about how you could be at a basketball game, and there's music, there's
Oh yeah.
sounds, there's music. The sneakers squeaking on the floor, the ball dribbling, it going through the swish and the hoop, obviously the whistle, the crowd. There's so much to be found there, and it's great to hear that's true for someone like you, that you can find inspiration from just about anything, including conversations.
I have a student who's in her thesis making these, what we've been referring to as sound collages, where she's collecting these sounds that she just, comes upon something and she's like, oh, I like the sound of that construction that's happening down the street, so I'm going to record it on my phone. Or I like the sound of, like you're talking about, like somebody's shoes, or the traffic on the street. And then she's using these as parts and layering them together. And it's very musical, but it's also designed from the standpoint of, these are all elements that she's composing in a way. And there will be other things that she'll add to them, but they're fascinating.
That's the interesting thing about art too, is that it's weird until it sounds good. Or it looks good,
I like the use of the word weird, and I like living in the space of weird from the standpoint of, conventional is easy. It's one of those things, if you've seen it done and you're just kind of repeating it. And certainly in the world of commercial design, you can make money by mimicry. And there are a lot of clients out there who, will come in and say, hey, we have, this fast food product and we want to look like our competitor. And it's like, really? Why? Why wouldn't you want to look like yourself?
Sure.
So this brings me back to the point that I wanted to make when you were talking about, like, who are you? You're a voice in this world, and that's valid. Just like when I talk to students about handwriting, especially, because a lot of them want to use typography that looks like it's handmade. So they'll go searching through all of these different font sites to find something that's like a handwritten typeface that they can type in all of the words to have it look like somebody's written it out. And I'm like, why wouldn't you just write it out? Because if you write it out, then it's unique to you.
Sure.
And every mark any of us makes is valid, in my opinion.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. Because sometimes when you're starting out and you have, I don't know, maybe an expectation, or you have role models or whatever that you look up to, you kind of think to yourself, hey, I'm nowhere near them. So what I'm doing right now is kind of not valid, for lack of a better term, where that's not the case. But sometimes you need somebody to tell you that. So I definitely appreciate that.
It all leads somewhere. So I like to talk about the fact that I'm a product of every day that I've lived before this day, and good days, bad days, uh, good making, successful making, things that people consider beautiful, and things that are terrible, and things that people consider ugly, things that I consider ugly. So, probably the hardest thing about doing this project, where I'm doing it every day and have done it for, 8 years now, is the fact that when I look back, I'm like, man, there's a lot of crap inside of here. There's some great highlights, but there's a lot of stuff where I'm like, ugh, I don't know. But, I purposely post it and never take it down from the standpoint of I like having the record of it. And I also think that it's the sort of parameters I've set for myself. So it keeps me honest.
Right.
From the standpoint of like, it has to be out there. And it's like, yeah, some of it's just not great. Mm-hmm. But again, it's led me to a point where I feel good about the things that I'm making now. Like tomorrow, I might feel like what I make is horrible, but I know, and I've through this space of continual iteration, I know that next good one is going to come.
Right. Well, that's part of the game. Sometimes you're the hammer, sometimes you're the nail.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Well, hey, Keith, I want to say thank you for coming on. This was a phenomenal conversation. I definitely appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I wanted to make sure everyone knows where they can find you and your art. So where can everyone find you?
Yeah, I'm very easy to find. I post every day on Facebook. So facebook.com/Keith Kitz, and Kitz is Kitz. So easy to find. That's the primary platform I use. If I add anything else, I'll certainly pop a link onto that page and you'll be able to find me other places. But Facebook is much maligned, but I have to say that it's been really good for me. It's connected me to the world.
Right. Yeah, I guess if there is an advantage, it is that. To Facebook. That's it, guys. Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure you follow the show wherever you listen. Subscribe. All the links are in the description. And that's it. Keith Kitz, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Peace.
Thank you.